Good morning. My name's Springate-Baginski, and I'm giving an introductory lecture to development studies. In this lecture, I want to introduce the main themes in development studies, and I'll also then look at major historical processes in brief. So I'm introducing this first slide by showing a photograph that I took a few years ago in Eastern India, and I like this picture because it shows both the very charming people in Eastern India, these tribal people, and also a great tragedy of how stunted their growth is. You can see they're significantly shorter than our research team that was visiting them, significantly shorter. And that's to do with malnutrition, a fundamental manifestation of poverty, lack of food security and an income to buy food. I'm sorry, forgive me for showing an even more traumatic picture. This is a photograph of people starving in the Great Famine in India in the middle 19th century. This is a great tragedy caused by partly crop failure and partly poor food distribution system. And I'm using that to illustrate and introduce a great development thinker, Pranat Bardhan, who's an Indian based in Berkeley University now. He discusses and presents this issue in the context of wider Indian development. And I just want to quote some introductory statements he makes. He says he was told that mothers in Western affluent countries often urge their children to finish their plates by reminding them of the hungry people in India. It may or may not be an effective strategy to make the rich eat more in the name of the poor, but it's interesting to recall that only a few centuries back, children in some of those same countries grew up with stories of the fabulous riches of India. But in the last century or two, India has become more often associated with endemic hunger or poverty, as this photograph illustrates. At the time of independence in 1947, following several decades of economic stagnation under British rule, India was one of the poorest countries in the world. It was the hope and aspiration of the founding fathers of the Indian Republic to relieve this crushing burden of poverty, and over the years, 5-year plans, political speeches and electoral slogans reiterated this primary goal. Yet, after more than three decades, Pranat Bardhan was writing in the middle 80s, India remains one of the poorest countries in the world, probably the largest single country contributor to the pool of the world's poor. This is one of the main books we use. It's an excellent study, Political Economy of Development in India, which explains a lot about why independent India has struggled to alleviate poverty, and why these tribal women we saw in the first picture remain so malnourished. So Pranat Bardhan has continued working, and he published a further book in academic paper, a couple of years ago, where he reviewed that initial analysis, and he recognises that even though over the last quarter century there has been substantial economic change in India and economic growth has improved, and that the depth of poverty seems to have declined significantly, nevertheless, indicators of malnutrition or ill health have not improved substantially, and the access of the poor to local commons on which they depend has in fact declined in many areas. Also, he observes that inequality has even increased, moving from levels equivalent or even higher than China to levels more similar to Latin America, which is a much higher level of inequality. This is in the Economic and Political Weekly Journal, Notes on Political Economy of India's Tortuous Transition. So Pranat Bardhan, a leading international development economist, in this few passages illustrates some of the fundamental issues that we look at in development. We are interested in the nature and causes of poverty. We're interested in the economic processes of growth, of investment. And we're interested in inequality, the distribution of benefits. Who is benefiting from economic growth? Who is benefiting maybe from economic stagnation even? So this brings out a number of the themes that we are interested in development. So to begin with, we better clarify what we mean by development. We use this word a lot, development, but you rarely find people defining exactly what they mean. If we look in the dictionary, the word has come into the English language from the French, développer, in the 13th century. When the Normans invaded Britain, they brought the French language with them, and the word has the initial meaning to unfold, to grow, to develop into a more mature condition. The different meanings that the word is used to connote today, there's a range of different meanings. Evolutionary processes, in the sense of change in the form of animals or plants. That's not so much what we're interested in. The bringing out of the latent capabilities, or the expansion. The development or the improvement of a tract of land, an estate. And really the key meaning that most people use is this sense of economic advancement of a region, one that may be less developed or underdeveloped, fulfilling its potential, usually economically, productively. These meanings are illustrated in the English dictionary. And so from this we can sense that the word development, when people use it, they're meaning improvement in some way over time. Improvement. So different people may be thinking of different sorts of improvement, but it's improvement over time. It's the sort of simplest definition. So then to measure development, we have to be a bit precise what sort of improvement we're interested in. So we typically in development studies we have a few different indicators. Maybe aggregate economic activity or production, maybe increase in crops or more industrial production would reflect in the national product. We also may be interested in incomes, maybe household income, so we may look at mean household income. And thirdly, we may be interested in some more subjective measures, whether people feel like their lives are improving, whether they feel more happy, whether they feel more secure. So, well-being measures. So why should we look at change over time? Why are we interested in a historical perspective? From an academic point of view, we can be certain that the present situation we're in, or poor people like these tribal groups in the first photo are in, is an outcome of historical processes. Maybe they've been evicted from land, maybe the environmental production has been undermined in some way. So there are historical causes over time that lead to wealth or poverty. Maybe someone else living next to them has taken their land and the neighbour is more wealthy. We're also interested to know what the trend is. Maybe it's bad at the moment, but maybe the trend is gradually improving, or maybe the trend is actually going to be getting worse. And lastly, we need to understand what are those interrelationships. Are they poor because someone else is rich? As we heard at the beginning, Pranab Bardhan was telling us that under the British colonial control, India became significantly poorer. So there's an interrelationship, as shown in the third chart on the right. Okay, so over time, these indicators of development may be fluctuating, and there may be particular what we call critical junctures where things change fundamentally. Some of those long-term historical junctures include the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, colonialization, and perhaps also information technology, this rapid spread in the last few decades. So I want to talk for the rest of the lecture about some of those critical junctures in human history and just clarify what we mean. And also, as we do that, we can think about what are the links between technical change, resource use, and economic production, maybe socio-economic and political issues. Because in development studies, we're usually looking at interdisciplinary approaches where we find the natural resources, the economic processes and the social processes come together in reality. So just to review that, we may be looking at several different factors to understand poverty and its root causes, we may be interested in historical context. This photograph illustrates colonial conflict between British and tribal groups in eastern India. Those tribal groups lost that contest, and that's one of the main reasons why they're so poor. We may also be looking at agricultural systems, food production, production technologies, cultural practices, land ownership patterns. We may be interested in economic development, industrialisation, investment, and so on. We may also look at cultural practices, gender roles, social stratification and classes, inequality. And lastly, politics, power contests. Who makes decisions in society, who gets forced, coerced to do things, and what social institutions prevail. Who is in the ruling party and whose interests they represent. So there's a range of different issues in development studies, and we try and encapsulate those, sometimes separately, but often we bring them together when we're looking at a particular problem. Okay, so now let's review some of the main historical phases. This could be a course on its own, but I'm just going to cover some of the main outline points in the next 20 minutes or so. So the earliest prehistoric evidence we have from the early Stone Age indicates how people adapted to their local ecological niche, typically through gathering products, gathering food and hunting. And in those times, as the human population spread around the world, populations were typically quite low density, and they exploited natural resources extensively. So some evidence suggests actually that society enjoyed a natural abundance in some areas, in areas where there were more resources available. Although some people have viewed this period of human existence as nasty, brutish and short, to quote Hobbes in the 17th century. In fact, archaeological evidence suggests that a flourishing of quite sophisticated cultures, good nutrition in the sense that people express their genetic potential with large bodies, healthy bone evidence, skeletons, etc. Things gradually began to change in the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, with the agricultural revolution. Humans started to settle or sedentarize in particular areas and started to intervene in wild plant cultivation, particularly cereals. The first evidence of flood recession agriculture emerged in about 8,000 before Common Era. By that we mean people deliberately selecting the plants that they prefer, planting them in areas where rivers flood seasonally, and finding that they could produce much more with less labour effort. So that's what we call flood recession agriculture. That emerged in the Fertile Crescent around Mesopotamia, what's now mainly Iraq. And it also, soon after, emerged independently, apparently, in several other areas of the world, in South Asia, in China, in Africa, in Central America. This pattern of flood recession agriculture involved selection of plants and their selective breeding for the particular traits that people favoured, larger production, larger yields, maybe particular flavours people wanted, and maybe resilience to drought. So this is the emergence of agriculture. Gradually also some animals became domesticated, horses, goats, cattle, chicken, etc. And by the 15th, 16th century, these crops became spread around the globe. So we have people all across Asia cultivating maize, which was a Central American crop originally. And if we look in textbooks, we can see fascinating maps showing the different areas, the connections between them as the agricultural practices spread. online. We can also find fascinating details. We don't have time to go into this now, unfortunately, but I'd recommend, if you're interested, to read Histories of Agriculture, that highlighted in the reading list. Based on agriculture, we saw the emergence of civilization. In the very early days of agriculture, and the pre-agricultural societies tended to be more egalitarian. We know that because the houses in the excavated sites were all the same sizes. In Kut al Hayuk, in Jericho, in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in South Asia, Indus Valley. And also, women seem to have had more power in society. We see lots of symbols of matriarchal power. Gradually, the agricultural surplus, the surplus food which people didn't need in their family to eat, that agricultural surplus became a central issue in society. Taxation emerged, or the appropriation or the voluntary donation of that agricultural surplus could pay for people not to farm. It allowed people to live off the land, but to feed themselves. So that led to a differentiation in society. The cultivators became specialised at cultivating, and the agricultural surplus fed other people to produce artisanal production, or to be priests, or to be rulers, or to be work in military. So we see this stratification of society and diversification, specialisation. People living in urban areas that didn't have to live close to agricultural production areas. We also see the emergence of trade, the emergence of monumental architecture, large buildings. So those builders could be fed from agriculture somewhere else. And soon after, a rapid expansion of technological development, transport, religion, military control, military technology. I'm going to whiz forward in time now. We're covering a lot in a very short period, but I want to now look at European history, and particularly the Renaissance. Why we're interested in the Renaissance is to see the emergence of the modern world, really, at least in Europe. So what we in Europe call the classical period really refers to the Greek and Roman civilizations, which were the earliest and greatest flowering of European culture up until about the 5th century, when the Western Roman Empire imploded, collapsed. In Europe there was a de-urbanization process thereafter, and the emergence of very hierarchical land ownership systems. After the 12th century and the 13th century, we start to see the emergence of a rebirth, a renaissance of that classical learning, growth of science, arts, particularly in Italy, which was enjoying an economic boom, and a growth of independent natural science inquiry, partly inspired by the transfer of Arabic learning. This natural science inquiry brought with it a cultural emphasis on individual autonomy and freedom in thought, a move away from a religious focus on God and transcending the material world and the immediate world towards a centrality for man, the secular world, what's called humanism, seeing the perfection of the man, human, rather than the perfection of God or worshipping of God. So this led in religious thought to the Reformation in Europe, the challenge to the dominance of the Catholic Church and the monopoly on worship of the Catholic Church. And it also led to what's been called the Age of Reason and the European Enlightenment. The Age of Reason was the sort of pinnacle, the emergence of a peaking of scientific thinking, of predominance of scientific or rational thinking, rather than relying on priests' views, religious views of how the world is. although there was certainly a close affinity between priests and the Age of Reason, most exemplified by Copernicus, who indeed himself was a priest. However, he wrote what's been called the defining epiphany that began the scientific revolution. His tract, the orbits of the celestial spheres, overthrew the religious view that Earth and God is at the centre of the universe, and he showed through scientific reasoning that in fact the Sun is at the centre of the solar system. He was followed subsequently by Descartes, by Newton, and many other great European scientists. So this Age of Reason, this scientific revolution, led also to a social revolution, what's been called the European Enlightenment, the thinking that this rationalism should not only be applied to the natural world, but also to the social world. We should reevaluate social organisation. We should be critical and start again, thinking how should society be organised. We shouldn't rely on hereditary principles and royal families to tell us what to do. We should put everything to the test of reason. Is it scientific? So this has led to a sort of rationalisation in society. We shouldn't tolerate or put up with poverty because it's not necessary. Just because there's always been poverty, it's not a reason to continue tolerating it. So the European Enlightenment led to a lot of improvements. There was an emphasis on improving the production of resources, innovations in agriculture, innovations in natural resource management, the application of science in agriculture. It also led to social upheavals such as the French Revolution and other revolutions or uprisings. And European Enlightenment, this view of applying rationalism, applying rationality in society, continues to be a major influence on development thinking. Most people in development studies will say, we apply a reasoned, scientific approach to understand why society is as it is and how can we improve it. How can we reduce dysfunctional outcomes like poverty, like malnutrition, like starvation? Continuing this theme of historical changes, over the 18th and 19th century in Europe, there was a radical industrial revolution where these scientific principles were applied for different production, particularly replacing manual labour with machine power in manufacturing, in agriculture increasingly. That was driven by development of iron, metallurgy, stronger steels, the use of refined coal for high temperature metallurgy, introduction of steam power in steam pumps for drainage and irrigation, train engines, industrial looms for textile production, ploughing. Mechanisation of textile industry is one of the critical factors of the Industrial Revolution. There's also been called the Second Industrial Revolution in the mid-19th century with the petrol combustion engine and electricity generation and transmission. This Industrial Revolution provided the technical basis for what's been called the agrarian transition, the movement of large populations off of agricultural lands to urban areas to work in factories. The labour productivity in rural areas could be massively increased by the use of mechanical power, so there was no longer a need for so many people in rural areas, and there was an increasing demand for labour to work in factories in urban areas. So the first real urbanisation in Europe occurred in Manchester, based on this Industrial Revolution, and cities throughout Europe grew very quickly, particularly in the 19th century. Okay, I'm going to skip forward now to another important theme in our review of the major historical events in the context of development. Colonialisation. So European powers, partly due to technological innovation, grew much more, had much more military power over the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and were able to dominate large areas of the world in Asia, and in the late 19th century in Africa. Large areas became taken over by traders, by merchants. British under the East India Company followed the Dutch model of the Dutch East India Company. French also expanded and took over large areas. And so that by the end of the Second World War in 1945, large areas of the globe were under colonial control. But European countries had really lost their ability to run these empires. They were exhausted after the war. So we see soon after this map, most of those countries becoming independent. It's a major transformation in the 40s, 50s and 60s, the end of the colonial era and the independence from much of the so-called developing world. Europe, which had been the predominant global power, was eclipsed by Cold War powers of Soviet Union and the United States. So we see the breakup of colonial empires, the formation of the United Nations. Those newly independent states, like India, like much of Africa, had a huge task of post-colonial reform, how to reorganize their states to focus on national and subnational priorities rather than contributing to European colonial interests. So a huge reform was needed. There was also the emergence of a non-aligned movement of many of those countries, led by Indonesia, Burma, Sri Lanka, India and Pakistan. And they condemned colonialism, including colonialism of the Soviet Union, and wanted to separate from this Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US. However, the Cold War came to predominate those aspirations as the United States and the Soviet Union set up client states and often client dictatorships across the developing world to serve their interests and to polarize the sort of, global politics. So there was along with this polarization in global politics, there was a sort of a globalization in development thinking. On the one hand, we have the classical liberal economic thought that trade is good in principle, it's mutually beneficial, and the more we liberalize trade, the more we release and relax restrictions on trade, the more everyone will benefit. So from Adam Smith onwards, economists in Europe have theorized just how beneficial trade is. And Walter Rostow in 1960 presented a theory of development called the stages of growth, indicating how underdeveloped countries can go through the transformations needed to reach a Western-style age of high mass consumption. This sort of view has been challenged by Marx, by Marxist and by socialist thinkers and several other different thinkers who say that trade is not always beneficial, particularly because we have bargaining power issues, that a colonial power may impose trade on a weaker power and may impose terms of trade which are unfavourable, maybe even exploitative. However, Marx himself felt this colonial era may be necessary as a stage towards future sort of utopia for the world in general, a utopian communism where the workers control the society. But we have to get to that stage by having urban workers, so we may need to go through stages of development. There are other schools of thought, so-called neo-Marxists, who feel that the underdevelopment, the lack of development, actually has been created by a sort of centre-periphery relationship, by by colonial powers exploiting peripheral powers. Again, as we see in this photograph, we started the lecture with, these people are poor because they lost land contests in the context of colonial land grabbing. So the policy recommendation of Marxists and neo-Marxists is disconnect from that exploitative relationship, and the exploitation may be persisting in the post-colonial era. So we have two competing views, and we have several other views we could cover if we had more time, including what's called a sort of alternative or autonomous development model that developing countries need to separate themselves from the global system. Now, much of this thinking and much of these debates emerged in the context of the Cold War. But by 1989, 1990, we saw the decline of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which is, again, a critical juncture in world history and development history. The Soviet Union, which had been one side of a sort of bipolar system, collapsed economically. So we've seen the transition from this bipolar system of the Cold War to a brief period of a sort of unipolar domination by the United States or maybe of global narratives and global politics, but quite rapidly a transition to a multipolar world where there are many different power centres, where although the United States may remain the predominant power, there are lots of challenges. Particularly these transition economies, Russia, the Soviet Union declined, but Russia has retained a lot of influence and power. There are also other emerging powers, India and China in particular, and also Brazil, which are often called the BRIC countries. We've also seen a democratization of the dictatorships which were clients in the Cold War system. Also, since the 90s, we've seen remarkable reductions in poverty in some areas, particularly in Asia. Some Asian economies have grown incredibly fast and have been able to reduce poverty very significantly. At the same time, during this high economic growth, we are seeing the manifestation of a very serious environmental crisis in lots of different aspects. The climate is probably the most serious issue that the world has to face, climate change, and it's human-induced by the level of economic activity. But there are many other environmental crises, soil degradation, desertification, biodiversity loss, and so on. So we've seen a step away from what we might call a totalizing development theory, trying to encapsulate everything in a simple concept. From the previous slide, the stages of economic growth, or a Marxist approach. In development studies, we do much less of that theorizing these days. We try to look at the phenomenon itself, maybe some modest theories, but we don't tend to deal in global total theories very much anymore. We try and make sense of particular phenomenon. Okay, so that's the end of my introductory talk, and I hope I've been able to cover some of the main themes and issues in development studies for you. Thanks very much.